on our first recording of the Daily Buzz 2023 Sundance Slam Dance style. My name is John Wildman. I'm the editor-in-chief of filmsgonewild.com. And I've got with me, oh man, it's so cool. We're back at the table together. Team Bitch Talk. We've got Angela Tabora and Erin with me. So our first recording is going to be talking about The Accidental Getaway Driver. This film is playing at the U.S. Dramatic Competition at Sundance. We have the director and writer Sing J. Lee with us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. All right. We always lead this off by having our filmmaker introduce our audience to the film. They likely haven't seen it as yet. So tell us about the film.
Okay. I mean, in a short and sweet way, I guess the way I see this is about four characters who are fragments that make up a whole. And that whole is a broken portrait in a search for belonging. I think it can be perceived in many different ways. You know, for me, like what drew me to the story in the very beginning, you know, that it's based on true events in 2016, Southern California. It was that I could see so many pieces of myself, fragments of my own memories and personal experiences in varying degrees within each of the four characters. And that's what I resonated with so deeply. And I just have a strong belief that those who watch it will be able to find their own different pieces and fragments that they can resonate with and be drawn into. And I think that's what can make it very universal. Well,
this is a great film for us to start off with, because it's one of those films that I think all three of us are really got a lot to ask and talk about. Angie, up first.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you describe it that way, Sing, because when I saw the title, I'm prepared for a little bit of adventure, action, a thriller. Mm-hmm. I wasn't prepared for how insightful the film is. You touch on a lot of really important topics of masculinity, ego, abandonment. So I'm curious about your process in writing this film and dealing with those issues within yourself.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it goes also, it's a really interesting insight, I think, that you had, because it falls into the larger conversation that we're having so prevalently about what are our stories and what does that mean? And there's so many ideas or perception of what that can be on a surface level. You know, there's a veneer to those stories. And I think if you ignore the title, if you ignore the intention or the premise of what this is set around, there is such a tender story. And I think that story is so true and tangible to all of us. And we focus on those, you know, it's those generational divides that happen between us and what happens in those pockets of culture. You know, it's like, for this in particular, you have the central character, Long Ma, who's an 80-year-old Vietnamese cab driver. You have to remember too that, like, when he came over, he's carrying with him this perception or this like time capsule of what his own like upbringing experiences are within a new generation over here. As we, I think, around the table, we know, even from us, from our own parents, from our grandparents, we exist in a different space. And it's constantly changing, transforming, or reducing. And it's within those spaces that we're trying to always search for a connection to our family and then a connection to our own culture. And I think within that, there's a much more interesting story than just the idea of seeing an immigrant tale that's caught up in a kidnapping.
I did not Google anything on purpose. So I don't know. I don't know a lot about the aftermath of the story, but I did want to ask how much was this true versus dramatized in the film? And then also, did the driver consult or any part of this story, the true story of this, consult on this film? Yeah, so I would say that inspired by is an important word within this. I wrote the script with Chris Chen. We co-wrote this. And once I'd done that, we met with the real Long Ma and just had a conversation with him in terms of getting his blessing in some ways, but also because I felt so strongly about, and it's also interesting what you're saying too, because I think you can be limited in just trying to reenact a real story. And I think it goes back to another question of like, who's responsible for making stories like this, and how are we responsible to these sort of kind of stories? And I always think about, you have to really resonate and understand the core idea of what that could be. It doesn't matter if you're like, you could be a
a scholar or an academic on a certain culture, but if you don't understand and feel or have shared similar life experiences with, then your perspective or the perspectives that could come out from this still might not, resonate. And so I felt a lot of strong beliefs that I feel the certain elements that exist within this film, whilst they may not be true to the events, the sentiment and the spirit is very much true to the emotions that those characters might have faced. And also, what those characters can represent. I think I'll go back to Longmire eventually, but I think each 4 of these characters, to me, the important part of it, and especially when I was writing it, was that they could become a commentary or a vessel for a much larger idea or theme that it can exist within them. Eddie, the youngest, I think, to me, represents how I felt when I was a teenager. I grew up in a very white-centric small town, and we were the only Chinese family there. You try and suffocate so much of yourself, or try and make that part of yourself so invisible so that you can just move through life and try and figure out, what are you trying to do? And then, when my family are from Hong Kong, so when I go back to Hong Kong, but I'm also seen as an other there. They know immediately that I'm not from Hong Kong. Yes. So you become another to both these places. So all you want to do is try and be invisible and fit in. So, for me, it's like Eddie is not based on, he's based on an idea and a theme that we can all relate to. And that extends to all the other characters as well in some form or another. But with Longmire, I wanted to retain his name because Long also means dragon. And dragon obviously represents so much of us in the East. Daeung, his name in Vietnamese actually means west, and so you already have this propulsion of duality that comes between the two of them. They're symbiotic in some way, and they are the soul of the film. And so with this idea of them being thematic vessels, when I spoke to Longmire, I just wanted to make sure that there was some kind of synergy with that. And I based his. I know people haven't seen the film yet, but there's one of his. I wanted to start the film with what I imagine might be his purest memory, his most innocent one. And I based that off my own father and his own stories. And so when I spoke to Longmire in real life, and I asked him about his childhood, coincidentally, he said it was the same, pretty much. And so for me, that was like, okay, I think the sentiment and the spirit is there, and that's important. That's the most important part.
And now the part of the show where we praise you as a filmmaker. It's been a while since I've watched a film that I've actually thought about the music of filmmaking. And I'm not talking about actual soundtrack music. I'm talking about how the style of a film can go to very quiet, subtle, intimate moments, and then have little moments of explosion. And in this, we have moments of tension that build up. We have surprising moments, and it's incredibly well done in that sometimes you lull us into an area where we think the film is going to go to a different place, and then you shock us out of that, or you remind us, no, we're actually in a tough situation here. And it's very artfully done. And I would love for you to talk about that, because, you're the writer, but, and director, but sometimes, that footage that you get, it doesn't translate through the editing process. So I would love for you to talk about how you approach that, to make sure that it wasn't all one note, and that that we weren't doing just a gangster drama, or we weren't just doing a character study. It was everything. Talk about that.
Oh no, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And also, I'm glad that you picked up on the score and the music of the film. And I like also that you were using that as like a metaphor for the tone of the film, but also the music itself. But I want to start with the music first, and we'll go into the other part. Music is fundamentally important, I think, not just to this film, but to myself. I actually was a musician before I thought I was going to become a filmmaker. So it's like, it's such a big part. It was a big part for me too, to find my place. We mentioned before, you're young, you're lost, you're trying to be invisible, but you try and find places to escape, and it's within music that I found my escape. So it always retained a really important place. And from the beginning, when I was speaking with different heads of department and the cast, I was saying, look, I really see this as a folktale of forgotten people. And I don't mean to use folktale in maybe the immediate perception, it just sounds a little like amorphous. But I mean it because for me, you know, like my dad's side of the family are Hakka Chinese, and I know we have a lot of folk songs. That's where our history exists, you know. And again, the history of certain kind of demographics aren't always recorded truthfully. There's a bias to it, but we have them in our songs. And interestingly enough as well, my paternal grandmother, she passed while I was writing this, and she speaks in the Hakka dialect. And I've never been able to have a conversation my whole life with her and understand her story from her words. And I know it was a very trying life that she had. So when she passed, it made it even more prominent, this idea of we lose fragments of our own history and our own stories and our own family stories once generations leave us. And the delicacy of just words and oral history and voice. So that's what I mean by a folktale, because to me, these characters too, you know, like you just said, they exist in this moment. And in real life, once the news cycle is done, once once these real people are leave the public consciousness, what happens to their life? Like we don't follow through. They just cease to exist for us. And to me, that also is a parallel to what I've just mentioned. And so with the music, when I was speaking to John Ong, the composer, I was saying, you know, like I really want it to translate through the music as well. This is, you know, like when I say folk song, I don't mean a certain kind. You know, it's like Gustavo Santaolalla is one of my favorite composers. I know he bases a lot of himself through the ronroco, which is, you know, the Argentinian basis of folk music. And he brings that into all those great films that he works with and Ñarritu and all that, you know, Babel. And you can create the sense of tension, the subversion and all that stuff without having to fall into convention. So beyond that, there was something earthy about this that I really wanted to do. I was like, John, like what can we do to elevate that? Where is the, you know, this is such a delicate film, you know, in terms of its characters and the fragility. Let's bring that through within the score too, and just give it just you know, the music version of being analog, you know, let's just have this texture to it, because that texture feels tangible and human to all of us. So anyway, that's the music part. But I also wanted to just quickly touch upon what you're talking about. You know, it's many different things. It's not just one, and it doesn't sit on the surface of the perception of a thriller. Well, like I grew up so much on Taiwanese new cinema, Hong Kong new wave, British kitchen sink realism. And within all of the three, the parallel that I feel that I was drawn to myself was it beautified the ordinary tempo of life. We observe life, and we allow the characters to lead us, the viewer, rather than, you know, something with a more plot-driven basis means that we force the characters and the viewer to go in a certain direction, which nullifies, you know, their cultural idiosyncrasies or just their personality. But if we can cultivate a stillness, which all of these movements do, and that's what I'm so drawn to, and what I want to continue to elevate and take with in my own way, that we, you know, contain these characters in the stillness of the frame, and we allow them to exist in these inconsequential minutes. What happens in the spaces in between? I'm more interested in those spaces than I am in the bluster. And so, you know, like the visual aspect of those movements too, like influenced me greatly in terms of, like, I'm very particular about the composition of the world, and that pairs so much with my cinematographer Cambio, who I've worked over the last 4 years with. And, you know, it's interesting. I mentioned, you know, influences. You know, he comes from the school of Latin cinema, and I come from the school of, you know, what I've just mentioned. But together, the sweet spot in the middle is that we both care about the soul first than anything else. And like, even in the way he lights, it comes from that first. And so, you know, it's like, if we're trying to set up a scene, what's the minimal thing we can do just to, like, elevate that character, and then we'll build from there, rather than flooding the place with all sorts of shapes and you know, and light, and then that loses the humanity of the moment. You know, there's a realness to it all.
Well, it's an incredibly thoughtful and yet dynamic film, and you know, and that is not easily achieved. So congratulations on that. Again, the film is The Accidental Getaway Driver, which is screening is in the U.S. Dramatic Competition at the Sundance Film Festival. And we've been talking with the director-writer, Sing J. Lee. It's been great having you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Loved it.
Thank you.
We do have a little more time if you want to close us out with a song. We have a few more minutes. Keep talking about this
music. I believe
music.
David can probably serenade as well.
really love this film.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.